Greetings, thank you for gathering here. First, I would like to ask you guys, who of you are Magento developers who actually develop custom modules or custom extensions, their own extensions? Very well. So you guys are intended audience. You're at the right place. The topic is integration tests in Magento, and this is intended for developers who would like to try automated tests in Magento and start developing their own tests today. We'll start from an overview of automated test types. We'll review what are the goals of them and how are they different. Then we'll stop by on integration tests more in detail. I'll demonstrate how to use the integration tests and demonstrate how to run them. Then developers who are interested in developing them may find useful an explanation of how the framework of integration tests is designed. And finally, we'll see where to get Magento integration tests and their documentation. So let's proceed with overview. Automated tests is an essential part of contemporary software, especially of the large applications. Development teams implement integration tests or automated tests along with their code during development cycle and put them on rails of continuous integration to tackle very important things, like whether the features of the product work as intended, whether the product is reliable, does it perform good enough, and whether it's compatible with the intended environments. First one is functional tests. This type is pretty simple. This is the most high-level type. Using functional tests, the product features are tested in the same way like a user would interact with the system. The simplest implementation of that is that a human, a quality assurance engineer, just performs some business scenarios, let's call it business scenario, or combines several scenarios, and automation of this type of tests is performed by recording what this human does and then refining this with some variables so that it could be run automatically later on a different environment, not only by human. Performance testing is a special approach when certain functional test, or as we already called it, business scenario, is executed several times, multiple times in various environment conditions and various frequency to determine performance bottlenecks. There are various subtypes of performance tests. For example, performance tests, they execute same scenario over and over again on regular basis and compare the results to see the trend, whether the performance is worsened or improved. The load tests assure that scenario runs successfully under normal and up to peak loads. The capacity tests allow to determine the practical limit of algorithm load while scenario executes successfully. And stress tests, they push the load way beyond the limits and see how the system behaves when it's broken. Next type is unit tests. Unit tests are supposed to verify small portions of algorithm by executing several methods or one method in different combinations of arguments and compare the return values. Unlike functional tests, the unit tests are written by programmers and for programmers. They are to be used every day as a safety net to see whether the code changes they introduce are backwards compatible, whether they don't affect algorithm stability, and whether it's correct at all. Developing code along with the unit tests would allow developers to overall raise the quality of the product and to improve the programming skills. If you have to implement unit tests with your code, you'll have to implement your code good. Otherwise, you won't be able to write tests well. And another type is static code analysis. The static code analysis tests perform analysis inspection of the source code without executing it to determine whether they correspond to certain standard, coding standard, or let's say, conventions. Unlike like unit tests, this is also programmer-oriented type of tests, which helps team of developers to collaborate more effectively by having the same coding standard. There are tools for programming languages, for different programming languages, which allow to do that. And for PHP, as Magento 2, for example, is implemented on PHP, we use 3 tools. PHP Code Sniffer to enforce the coding standard, PHP Mess Detector to see whether there are worst practices or poor designed code anywhere, and PHP Copy Paste Detector, well, to detect the copy paste. Now let's take a closer look on different type of automated tests, integration tests, the main topic for today. The goal of integration tests is to execute programming code deployed on close to real environment. In other words, integration tests intend the product to interact with environment. This type of tests concentrates on how system works as a whole rather than their components or architectural layers by their own. It doesn't aim to cover anything, everything 100%. It's just enough to run the algorithm by critical path and make sure that the system just interacts with the environment. A good example of integration tests can be running the same test suite on different database platforms. Of course, if the if the application supports multiple database platforms. Integration tests bring up value a bit different from other types of tests. From business perspective, that's a measurement how stable the product is now. The business user, which is any user or product owner, sometimes they don't want the detailed code coverage analysis report. They just want to know in simple way, just some small number which will say, okay, it's stable, not stable, very stable, or unstable. The percent of code coverage by integration tests will exactly say this to the product owner. This is the simple representation of whether the product is stable. Integration tests have nature similar to unit tests because they are implemented and they are executed in the same way, but also allow to discover bugs related to the environment. Otherwise, if we don't run integration tests, such bugs can leak into customer environment, which is an unpleasant thing for both you guys developers and for your customers. Unlike in unit tests, the less environment and objects are mocked, the better for the integration tests. Execution of unit tests has narrow scope for a module or a class, while integration tests pierce through entire architectural layers sandwich and have just assert the slice of the system. For example, in MVC pattern, it would just go through controllers, models, view to assert everything. As much modules as possible, by the way. This is what kind of interaction to expect when you run integration tests. The application should be deployed before running integration tests and installed. It should interact with real database and it should utilize the real file system and cache. A use case for Magento 2 project. Magento is a product that supports multiple RDBMS, which already was mentioned, MySQL, Oracle, and MS SQL. But I, as a developer, don't like to work with all these at the same time because it will consume my precious time. So I just develop on my favorite platform and pull or push the code to the repository, and continuous integration will verify my code for other database platforms. And of course, report any issues if they are found. So what kind of integration testing? So yeah, this kind of integration testing is implemented in Magento 2 by test suite that works on integration testing framework, so-called framework. Let's see how this framework can be used. So we'll review its initial configuration, set up environment, and run the test suite. Magento integration testing framework is built on top of PHPUnit framework. Therefore, the latter needs to be installed in order to run. The PHPUnit version 3.5 or later is needed. Before running test suite, Magento application instance will automatically be installed into a database, into an empty database, and we need to have a folder with writable access where Magento instance will store its cache, its temporary files, anything else. Integration tests and framework reside in dev test integration folder relative to Magento root. I'll demonstrate this gradually, so you'll see actually during the demo you'll see these files. Here we distinguish several major areas. The test suite, the green area, is a folder where we can find a set of regular PHPUnit test cases. I say regular because they are descendants of the standard PHPUnit framework test case class. One of the key points in Magento integration tests that we try to reuse PHPUnit framework features as much as possible, not to invent anything else. If PHPUnit is enough, then we don't need anything else, so we'll just utilize all its capabilities. Under framework folder, there is framework, this one area. There is Bootstrap PHP. This is a traditional thing when you use PHPUnit. And under framework Magento folder, these are classes that customize PHPUnit framework. PHPUnit has a capability to be customized. There is standard way, you can find it in documentation. And these classes implement Magento-specific customizations. We'll stop by on them later. And the framework tests folder, contains the test suite for the integration testing framework. So the integration testing framework also is covered by tests, but these are unit tests. And it has nothing to do with the test suite, with this green folder. Okay? Also, there are configuration XML files, like these, at etc local MSSQL, MySQL, and here are PHPUnit.xml, which are used to customize Magento before running integration tests. We'll stop by on them later. And the TMP folder is that I mentioned before. Magento application uses it to store its temporary stuff, and each instance that is installed by integration tests is in a subfolder of this folder. PHPUnit features a fallback mechanism for configuration files. When you run PHPUnit from command line, it will look for phpunit.xml file, or if not found, it will look for phpunit.xml.dist file. So that in this way you can fiddle with the configuration. Out of the box, Magento has phpunit.xml.dist file, and locally you can copy it and rename as phpunit.xml, and in such way you will be able to customize it and not change the, let's say, core files or just whatever you checked out. Integration testing framework replicates this behavior for etc local XML files. etc local XML files, these are prototypes for Magento initial configuration. This means that we'll look first for local vendor.xml. If not found, we'll fall back to xml.dist file. Before running tests, first time, we start from setting up configuration in phpunit.xml. The phpunit framework allows to define constants in the file, which will be used in the source code. This is a standard feature of phpunit. So we have a few constants here. The test local config file specifies path to Magento local XML prototype, which contains database credentials, essentially. The test global config files and test module config files specifies how to load Magento configuration, the way how Magento will read the XML files of configuration when it initializes. And test shutdown method, this is an optional constant that allows you to specify whether, after running the test suite, whether to wipe out everything to clean up or just to restore database. It means that before running integration test first time, it will create a database backup, and then if you make the option restore database, it will go back and get the database from that dump. So also there are optional constants that allow to collect profiling results in a CSV file, and for example use it for your performance metrics. So they are disabled by default. So credentials for database where application is installed in are specified in the etc local vendor.xml files, which are prototypes of Magento XML, local XML files. Note that besides the database credentials, it has a block of encryption key and installation date. Make sure not to modify this, because if there are valid values, Magento will assume that it is already installed and will not execute the SQL upgrade scripts. Now we know enough to run the integration tests. Time for a demo. So first we'll go through environment. We'll see if my laptop is capable of running integration tests. I'll verify the configuration in my working copy of Magento and run the test suite. So this is my working copy of Magento. First I'll verify if I have PHP unit. Okay, it says that Sebastian Bergman is here with his framework. Then I need to, okay, let's go to the working copy of Magento. This is a working copy of Magento 2, and here we have folder dev tests integration, and here we have the phpunit.xml.dist. Let's see what it is inside. Let's go straight to the constants. So I see that all the constants are on place. I see the test shutdown method uninstall. I don't like this. I need to customize it. So I'm going to not spoil this precious file. I'll just copy it as phpunit.xml. For example, not to commit accidentally to repository. It is ignored. It is you see the git ignore file. It will ignore the file. So phpunit.xml. Open it. And I just want to remove the uninstall. So empty means just do nothing. After running the test suite, it will not do anything. Okay. Now let's get back to the working copy and see whether database credentials are okay. I forgot to tell you that it will look by default for etc local mysql.xml. Okay, I'm fine. I like MySQL. Let's see. Local mysql.xml.dist. We don't have the .xml file, but we have .xml.dist file. Therefore, it will be loaded. Just let's see what credentials to database I need. That's localhost, root, and the database name is Magento integration tests. Okay. Let's connect to MySQL. Creating this database. It has been created. And yeah, now I'm ready to run the integration tests. I'm going to dev tests integration and run php unit command. php unit. So meanwhile, while it runs, right now it is installing database, installing Magento into the database I provided. We can look at it by connecting to database in meanwhile. So MySQL, just connect to that database, show tables, and it has already tables, so it's installing. And while it's installing in database, it's also creating it already started running integration test. So while let's see, while it runs, we'll see the temporary folder. So dev test integration, TMP folder, and it has created this fancy folder with hash. And here we have cache, full page cache, whatever. So everything that's needed for operating Magento application. And the Bootstrap backup.sql, this is the database dump. Okay, let's see. So integration tests are running. We have 1,000 tests here. So let's wait while it executes. And after that, after all the test suite will execute, I expect that system will not uninstall itself. And after that, I will run one test and ask the system to uninstall itself. For that, I'm going back to phpunit.xml and say, return it back to uninstall. Uninstall. So next launch of integration tests should cause uninstallation. Here. Meanwhile, I opened. Okay, it's going to end. I opened another window, so let's say PHP unit. And in order to run one test case, I need to specify the file name. Test suite, the physical path to the file name. Let's say Mage. Let's say Mage core helper. So Mage core helper data test. Okay, here we have the test suite already finished, and just to make sure, we have the file system and database on place. So the sandbox folder is here. Okay, now let's run one test. Remembering that we have already modified the configuration, it has executed the test, and there is no sandbox folder anymore. And let's see what is inside the database. There is Magento integration tests database. Showing tables, none. Okay, so we're good. Now let's get back to presentation. Now that we know how to run integration tests in Magento, let's see from developers, from programmers' standpoint, how it is designed. If you want to, and why do we need to build something on top of PHP unit framework? The first, what integration testing framework does is bootstrapping Magento application. A fully automatic installation, full cleanup, or just database restoration. Entry point for this is the framework/bootstrap PHP file, which has Magento test bootstrap class under the hood. Besides performing the bootstrapping routines, this object has getters for environment stuff like path to the temporary folder where the Magento application is deployed. And Magento test DB classes are database adapters that are used by Bootstrap for dealing with database cleanup and handling backups. Executing a lot of code in one scope in Magento is a challenging task because there is application object with certain state. Some code may be dependent on configuration, and there is code that relies on database object that should already exist. Otherwise, it won't make sense to test this code. To address these difficulties and simplify programmers' life, the integration testing framework has so-called listener. This is a standard way to customize PHP unit. As you may know, PHP unit framework utilizes PHPDoc annotations to execute additional instructions. So basically PHPDoc is sort of executable code in PHP unit. So Magento Test Listener implements, it aggregates a few other customizations that implement custom PHPDoc directives, which work for testing Magento-specific features. First one is Magento APP isolation annotation. It specifies to reset state of registry, reinstantiate application object, and clean up part of cache. Cleaning up global objects manually without this annotation would increase code complexity, especially because programmer would have to implement try-catch block everywhere, because PHP unit assertion can produce an exception when it fails. This example illustrates how compact can a test be in virtue of this Magento APP isolation. Otherwise, after executing this code, we would have to clean up the registry at all. So, and it should be done in the try and in the catch block. It's not it would just obfuscate the test. And to get into some conditional block when the critical path of algorithm requires some configuration fixture, so sometimes a system configuration value needs to be set up first. That's a lot of code to do that, especially considering the try-catch necessity. The try-catch necessity with the global objects is our problem, so we need to tackle it with these directives. The Magento config fixture annotation purpose is to tackle this problem. It allows to set system configuration value before executing test and reverting it back after execution, regardless whether it failed or not. It can be specified on test case level or test level or both, and test level overrides test case level. A value can be set for like directly into configuration node in the system, in the XML of config model. Also, it can be set for certain store view or so-called current store view. Some tests make sense only if there is an object already existing in database and your code that you are going to test is essentially about loading the object. So you should have already an ID and you load it and assert whether it's correct or not. And creating and persisting an entity before the test and then cleaning up after the test would also obfuscate the code. And the try-catch problem is still here. In this case, the Magento data fixture directives comes for help. It works like an include instruction, like include script just wrapped into a database transaction. Start transaction before including, run the script, execute the test, and revert the transaction. One important thing to know when composing such scripts, don't use database instructions directly, just use application API. It will allow to make your tests more durable and won't make your scripts depending on certain database vendor. The integration testing framework also contains few utility classes that help to develop certain typical tests. Abstract controller test case, this one, abstract controller test case, allows to dispatch Magento controller actions, assert redirects, assert 404 errors, as well as it contains the stubs for HTTP request and response objects. Magento test entity, this is a helper for testing create, read, update, delete operations for a typical Magento entity which extends MageCore model abstract. Other classes include special test case, special test suite that allows to execute test groups depending on set of enabled modules. For example, if you have your own modules, you can have Magento Community Edition plus set your modules, or you can configure Magento Enterprise Edition plus your modules. Or you can create your own edition using phpunit.xml, which will specify which test to run. By default, it just runs all the tests in the test suite folder. And there are different small helpers. I will not stop on them. Example, testing controller actions using Magento test case controller abstract. Among invoked methods here, so as I mentioned maybe, this class extends the standard test case of PHP unit. It has several methods, several custom methods. Dispatch allows, the method dispatch allows to dispatch a controller action by specifying just a request URI. The assert 404 not found will get into the response object and see if there is 404 code. The assert redirect will just see if there is redirect in the response object. And there are getters and setters for the HTTP request and response objects, so that before test you can set some parameters, request parameters into the HTTP request object. Another example demonstrates how to test entity create, read, update, delete operations. Constructor of this Magento test entity requires instance of Mage core model abstract and an array of data which to update during running the test. So there are 4 steps. First is persist object in database. This object I create here. The object here set the required data, and the test CRUD method will execute this scenario. So first he saves this object to database and asserts that there is an ID, new ID. Second step is to read this object from database using the newly created ID. Then update object data from this array and also persist it and assert whether it's okay, whether it can be loaded with the new updated data. And finally, delete the object from database. So that's sort of automation, because this is a typical test case. Separately, I would like to mention code integrity tests. This subtype of integration tests that scan entire code base and verify compliance of the code to some coding standard or conventions. For example, the system may implement templates and like template engine, and its components may introduce templates. Such integrity test would go through the system, find templates, find declared templates, verify whether the templates exist, execute them, and see whether they produce errors or not. Another example is scanning view files for references to static resources such as CSS files, JavaScript files, and to find broken links. So right now, with modification of Magento view layer, when we relocate files from one folder to another, in order to check ourselves, we implement such code integrity test, which does not allow us to make errors. And human, for example, we have 500 files to relocate. As human, I can make a mistake. It's impossible to make it perfect. So this kind of integrity integration tests allow me to not produce such errors. The primary difference of the integrity test from static code analysis is that it executes the code. So code tests itself in this way. And a few last notes for programmers who would like to start implementing tests. Always keep in mind the isolation problem. Yes, the integration test should interact with environment, but the tests between each other should be isolated. This is very important because you can poison your data in one test, and if you don't isolate it properly, you'll have problem in the second one. When dealing with fixtures, I'll just repeat myself, do not use database queries directly, just use the application API. Otherwise, your test will be just fragile. And keep performance of tests adequate to running on a developer machine, because if they work slow, you will not want to run it. At this point, I'll just announce where to get the integration test and framework and documentation. The code is publicly available in Magento 2 project. Here you can see Magento 2 SVN public repository URL. But soon this link will be gone. We already internally switched to Git, and soon we'll replace this link with URL to Git repository. Stay tuned. Documentation for integration tests is available in product documentation wiki space, developer's guide. There are several integration test guides which are part of a general purpose Magento automated testing guide. These documents have all the same information I presented right now, but just more detailed. And the link will be announced as soon as we deploy it on public server. Our sysadmins are working right now, so stay tuned on Twitter or Magento blog. And this is it. This is my Twitter if you want to track, and I'm ready for questions. The question was, is there any reason that we don't use it in Magento 1?
No, not that why you don't use it, why it could not be used. Like, could you use it in Magento 1 now?
It can be used in Magento 1. And internally, we actually ported down the integration test into Magento 1, but we done it by Magento 2 team, and we'll see how to bring it back to Magento 1. The test suite will be different because we change code in Magento 2, but the framework, yeah, essentially the same. Even now, you can just download it, and if you want to play, you can download the code from the repository and try to run it on Magento 1. You'll find some problems, but they are solvable. I mean, in 1-2 days, you can do it by yourself.
Question from Twitter, which is any reason why the class names are Magento underscore instead of Mage underscore?
The question was any reason why the class names are start from Magento underscore rather than Mage underscore. We use Mage underscore in the app, in the application, and Magento underscore, this is the new library. So it probably will replace variant underscore. It is located in, normally they are located in lib folder. Okay, great. No questions? Thank you so much. Yes. The question was which code standard we use for PHP-CS. So we went to PHP-CS, and there is ruleset.xml for Zen framework coding standard, and they state that it is out of date. So we took it and refined. We checked against the Zen framework coding standard. And gradually, while we work in Magento 2, if we see some issue with coding standard and we want to validate it automatically, we'll just implement our own code sniffers and add it to the ruleset.xml. All right.